Okay, thanks for the great introduction. Thanks for inviting me to talk here. Real friends won't let you deploy black box models, and that's because they know your data isn't what you think it is. So that's why friends will rescue you. Before I jump into a bunch of examples of this and what we're trying to do about it, I just want to say there's a lot of people who have worked on this the last 10 years, a bunch of great interns, a bunch of great students, faculty at different universities, and doctors at hospitals. You'll see I'll use a lot of medical examples. Okay, let's jump in with something fun, a sort of brief history of machine learning. So perceptrons in the 50s, then k-nearest neighbor in the 60s, decision trees in the 70s. Then we saw, the second coming of neural nets in the 80s. And then we saw more principled methods in the 90s, maybe Bayes nets and SVMs. By 2000, we were starting to do boosted trees, random forests. You've even got a room here called random forests. SVMs were still thought by some to be the answer for tabular data, but they are no longer as popular as they were. Now we have deep neural nets happening, around 2008, plus or minus. And for tabular data, we have gradient boosted trees, random forests, and ensembles of trees are doing exceptionally well. And now we have neural nets again, this time as foundation models, transformers, LLMs. So it's been really good for neural nets. So if you're interested in text, images of cats, acoustic signals, things like that, neural nets sort of just keep coming back and rescuing us, right? So the first coming of neural nets couldn't do any of this because it was really just a linear model. But the second coming had a hidden layer, so it could do it. The third coming had lots of hidden layers, so it could do it even better. And of course, now we really know how to train these things exceptionally well in LLMs, and we know how to get massive amounts of interesting data for them. So we're doing incredibly well with deep learning. And that really is fantastic news for people who are working on text, images, acoustic signals, natural signals, things like that. You've got to ask yourself, though, for people who are working on tabular data, and tabular data is more than 50% perhaps of the world's problems, for people who are working on tabular data, what's going to sort of be the method of choice going forward? And one possibility is that it's going to be this glass box learning that I'm going to talk about today. And that's because people find there are just huge advantages to having intelligibility if you can get that without too much other harm. So now you might be thinking, but there's a lot of other harm. I mean, who really wants to use glass box learning, for their company's future, right? Isn't that too low of a bar to use if you're going to risk your company on it? Well, the good news is you've been taught that there's this trade-off between black box models and glass box models, that the black box models are these things, hold on a second. The black box models are these things on the left. These are deep neural nets, boosted trees, random forests, ensembles of these things. And that for tabular data, this is the way you get accuracy. And unfortunately, you just have to accept that you're not going to understand everything that's going on inside these things, even if you try opening them up with something like Lime, which will give you an approximate explanation of what might be going on. And that if you want to use glass box methods, hey, you just got to accept a loss in accuracy. They're just, by design, too simple. Well, the good news is that that's not really true for tabular data anymore. In the last 10 years, we've now been able to develop methods, and we'll talk mainly about these explainable boosting machines today, but they're just one of multiple glass box methods that are just as accurate on most tabular data sets as the black box methods, but it turns out they're even more interpretable than standard interpretable methods such as, say, linear or logistic regression. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, let me give you a little bit of evidence that this might be true. This is 10 classification data sets on the left here, and we've got the AUC on test data for these data sets, and here's EBMs, this glass box method that we'll talk about. And on the far right, I've got some full complexity models. That's random forests that have been carefully tuned. It's gradient boosted trees that have been optimized to a certain depth that turned out to be best on average for these problems. And you'll notice, if you look at the bottom, the average, that the average AUC for the EBMs is 0.866 across these data sets, and it's also, just by accident, 0.866 for the black box methods. That is, at least on these data sets, we're not seeing any real loss. We're not seeing a gain from the glass box methods, but we're not seeing a loss relative to the black box methods, and that's good news, because as you're going to see, the glass box methods come with some extra feature, which is that they're very interpretable. Now, you might not want to take my word for that, because I'm one of the authors on that paper. This is some work from Cynthia Rudin, who is another famous researcher working on interpretable models. And she and her students at Duke did a big bake-off of lots of different methods. And they observed that the best interpretable models can perform about as well as the best black box methods, which again, in their experiments, was also XGBoost. And it turned out the best method they used that was glassbox turned out to be EBMs. So they used the open source package that we had released, and that turned out to be the most accurate glassbox method. And then I won't talk about it much more today. These EBMs are boosted tree-based models that have been carefully constrained to make sure that what they learn is interpretable. I'm not going to talk about this more than just a slide, but you can also train these glassbox methods with neural nets if you carefully control the architecture of the neural net. So this is joint work with some people at Google, at Microsoft, and Jeff Hinton at Toronto. And these are neural additive models. And there's now about a half a dozen different competing methods for trying to get neural nets to train these interpretable models that I'm going to show you. But we won't talk about that more unless you want to ask questions. Okay, let me tell you what these things are. They're a form of what's known as generalized additive models. The simplest additive model is linear and logistic regression. Very interpretable, right? It's either a table of slopes or it's a bunch of straight lines on graphs. Sadly, not very accurate on complex data, and that's because it can't model nonlinearities. And one thing many people don't realize about these models is some people think, well, maybe you can't trust the magnitude of the coefficients, but you can at least trust whether it's a positive or negative coefficient, the sign. It turns out they often get the sign wrong because they're struggling so hard to fit complex data that they're not well suited for, that they actually end up trading off on some coefficients, actually getting the wrong sign. So you can't even trust the direction of the effect from these models. So you should be very, very careful if you have data that is very nonlinear from trusting what these models say. Now, at the other extreme, we've got black box models. Not very interpretable, that's why we call them black box, but they can be very accurate, and that's, of course, because they can model nonlinearities. And one thing that's interesting, if you use something like SHAP or LIME to open these things up and try to understand what's going on inside, you'll see they often, because they're fairly complex models, they often learn some spurious effects in addition to all the true statistical effects that they learn. But these are good methods, and I also like LIME and SHAP, so if you must use black box methods, please try to open up your models and understand them, for all the reasons that I'm going to explain in the rest of the presentation. In the middle, there's sort of the Goldilocks models. These are generalized additive models of which explainable boosting machines, EBMs, are just one example, just one algorithm. They're much more interpretable than linear and logistic regression, and that's because in the hands of an expert, a graph like this blue line here could be the approximation of this graph, but see the detail in the graph. It says, well, there's a flat spot here of low risk, then risk goes up kind of rapidly, then it flattens off, and risk even goes up a little bit if you go to the left of this flat spot. That's something the straight line can't show you. So the only way you could achieve this with linear models is if you kind of knew in advance to do some very clever feature engineering and made this one feature into 2, 5, 10 features. So in the hands of an expert, this is much more interpretable. I'm going to show you many examples of these. These can be much more accurate than linear models because they can model nonlinearities. And what's interesting is because they're a very restricted model class, they actually have more in common with the linear logistic methods than they do with the black box methods, and they're much less likely to learn these spurious effects that we often see in the black box models. But they're much more likely to not lie to you and get things like the sign wrong, and that's because they can actually represent the data pretty well. I'm going to show you lots of examples of these. We didn't invent these. They were invented by statisticians at Stanford in the late 80s, right? So that's 40 plus years ago, okay? So these things have really been around a long time. They predate most of machine learning. They predate computers. They predate the internet. Okay, so these have been around. Our contribution is going to be to apply modern machine learning algorithms, horsepower, and use big data sets to really make these things fire on all cylinders. Like, we're going to put this algorithm class on steroids. So that's going to be our contribution. And surprisingly, in the process of doing that, they're suddenly going to become competitive with black box methods, which, by the way, is not something we expected when we started doing the work. We're going to try to do as well as we could. We never expected to achieve parity with black box methods with these things. Let me mathematically just show you what these are. Linear models, slope times a feature, plus a slope times a feature, plus an intercept. Black box models, let's just call them some arbitrary function of all the features. They're obviously different from each other. The simplest thing that you would call a generalized additive model is this. It's a function of feature 1 plus another function of feature 2 plus another function of feature 3. It's a function of each feature. Notice right now it's a function for each feature, but it's not a function of combinations of features. And these functions can be arbitrarily complex. They can be nonlinear, multimodal, all that sort of thing. They can be a straight line if that's what they should be. But right now, this is a tremendous restriction that these are functions of individual features. Now, we can make this model class a little richer. So now, this is still a generalized additive model, but now it has pairwise effects and three-way effects. So this is the sum of functions of individual features, the line above. Here's the sum of functions of pairs of features. And here's the sum of functions of triples of features. So this model class is getting more complex, it's getting richer. And in fact, what we'll try to do is restrict ourselves to main effects, functions of individual features, and then we'll do a small number of the most important pairwise effects. And we'll avoid the three-way combinations and four-way combinations of features if we can, because those are harder to interpret. So they become higher dimensional objects that it's hard to wrap your head around. Okay. Let me jump in and give you an example. Some of you may have seen this before. So all of you, I'm sorry to say, have pneumonia, and our goal is to predict which of you are at highest risk, perhaps of dying from your pneumonia, because we might want to admit you to the hospital, whereas the rest of you should be given chicken soup, antibiotics, and call the doctor in 3 days if you don't feel better. It's an old data set. It's got 46 features in it. Now, the model class we're using is a function of a feature plus a function of a feature, so we're going to have 46 functions, one for each feature. We'll have an intercept, and then we're going to throw in 10 pairwise interactions. So we'll have 10 more functions of the most important pairs. So we'll have 56 functions plus an intercept. From 30,000 foot, or what's that, 10,000 meter level point of view, this is what that looks like. So we have a function of risk, that's your chance of dying from pneumonia, a function of your age, a function of whether you have asthma or not, a function of your respiration rate, a function of your creatinine level in your blood urea nitrogen in your blood. And the way you use this is not marginalization, by the way, even though it looks like it. And the way you use this is you look up the person's age on the x-axis, you read off a contribution to risk on the y-axis, and you write that number down. In this case, mine is 0.23. You look up if the person does or does not have asthma, so that puts them on the left or right-hand side. You put down the height of the graph at the left or right-hand side. You're going to get 56 of these numbers plus an intercept, so you're going to get a bunch of numbers. You add them all together, and that gives you a score, and you just do standard logistic regression, 1 over 1 plus e to the minus score. Okay, so this is a close cousin to logistic regression. The only difference is it's not linear logistic regression, it's nonlinear logistic regression. In fact, if this had been linear logistic regression, this is what it would look like. The exponent would have a linear model up here, and that's exactly how logistic regression is trained. But instead, we have a nonlinear sum of functions up there. So you can imagine that it's kind of like we have the graphs or the scores that come from the graphs for each patient up in that exponent. So that's what things look like. Here we're doing classification, so that's logistic. And it's just important to realize that these scores are on a log scale. If you're into neural nets, they're logits. Okay, so a small difference here. For example, a difference of +1 in risk is a difference from, say, 50% mortality risk to 75%. mortality risk. And then if you go to +2, that's like 88%. If you go to +3, of course, that's our 95% kind of confidence interval. So small differences, especially if they come from just one or two features, are very significant. So that's just important to realize. If we were doing regression, then the natural units on the vertical scale are, in fact, whatever we're trying to predict, say height or income or sales price or something like that. Okay, let's zoom in. This is the graph for risk as a function of the patient's age. Remember, we're trying to predict if the patient might die from pneumonia. This graph has carefully been learned by a clever algorithm in parallel with all the other functions. Okay, so this is not marginalization where you look at one effect at a time, one feature at a time. These graphs are all learned together, and because of that, they don't multiple count evidence, and they all learn to work together. If there's some effect that's captured by some other graph, even though it's correlated with the feature in this graph won't pick it up because it's already captured somewhere else. Okay, the bottom is just a histogram of our patients. Most patients are between 60 and 90 in this data set, some younger and a few older. The top graph is what the model has learned. Up is higher risk, down is lower risk. So let's read this graph. Well, it's pretty good to be young. And young, as far as the model is concerned, is everybody under, say, 50. It doesn't even distinguish between people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. It says, well, they all look equally low risk, even though it could distinguish between them if it needed to. Then risk goes up a little bit as you go through your 50s into your 60s. Surprising, like, jump in risk happening at about 66, 67, 68, 69. This is US data. That's when people are retiring often in the US. And things like Medicare suddenly happen. You know, your insurance is no longer provided by a company, it's provided by the government. All sorts of things happen, including perhaps your urgency to get to care changes because you're not going to work every day. It's possible you've moved to your dream home in Florida or wherever. Maybe you don't even have a doctor lined up where you are now. Maybe you didn't do Medicare right. Maybe you just don't know how to use Medicare yet. All right, so there's lots of reasons why this happens. We often see this effect in US data at retirement, which you might have thought was going to be good for you, but not for all conditions is it good for you. We don't always see that same effect in data from the EU. So, and that's because the healthcare is quite different at retirement. We don't see these effects. All right, nobody's surprised that risk is going up pretty rapidly in your 70s and your 80s. The patient's becoming elderly, that makes sense. Surprising step function rise in risk at 85, which is a kind of round number. Surprising flatness in risk in the upper 80s and 90s, and then an even more surprising drop in risk, step function drop in risk, is happening at about 100, 101. So what's happening here at 85? There's nothing in US healthcare that says treat a patient who's 86 differently than a patient who's 84. We think what's happening, this is an old data set, the average life expectancy in this data set's about 79 or 80. So patients who are 85 and older are quite elderly in this data set. And we think what's happening is that unconsciously, clinicians, the patient's family, is making decisions which gives a little less aggressive care to very sick pneumonia patients who happen to be over 85. As in, Grandpa's 86, he's got a number of illnesses associated with being this old. Now, because of those other comorbidities, now Grandpa's got pneumonia. The first 2 rounds of antibiotics have not helped. We're not really doing Grandpa any favors here. Maybe it's time not to push so hard. So that's what we think is happening at 85. Because it's hard to explain it any other way. It's not like your biology knows you suddenly went around the sun, 84, then 85 times. And there's nothing in policy that says you should treat patients differently. What about the drop at 100? So if the rise at 85 is a sort of unconscious social effect, right, as opposed to a true biological effect or a true medical policy effect, we think the drop at 100 is exactly the same thing. And doctors will confirm this when we talk to this, but they'll confirm it in private, not usually publicly. Pneumonia is a reasonably treatable illness. You've got a patient who's made it to being 100. So they're a centenarian. Maybe their 101st birthday is 2 months away. They've got pneumonia. You just go for the record. If you need a third, a third treatment with those weird antibiotics that we hold in reserve, you go for it. You're going to do everything you can to get that patient. And the patient, 4 out of 5 times, will be a woman. You'll do everything you can to get that woman to her 101st birthday. So you really will fight to do this. And for a treatable illness, reasonably often, if you fight hard enough, you can be successful. Now, if this was a terminal illness, you're not doing the patients any favor by struggling very hard to sort of add 1 more month of what might be unpleasant final stages of life. But for a treatable illness, we see this, and doctors confirm when I give this kind of presentation at a medical audience. They come up to me and say, oh, we had a patient who had this, another treatable thing. She was 102, and we just pulled out the stops. We did everything, and it worked. She's still here. Isn't that great? Okay. Now, there's 56 of these graphs in the model. I'm not going to show you all of them because you want to have beer, before the weekend. This model, it turns out, is the most accurate model anyone's ever been able to train on the data set. Now, a really good ensemble of neural nets is equally accurate. But this is the most accurate model anybody's ever trained. Every graph has interesting stories like this. And look at the detail we're talking about. Well, anything under 50 is sort of equal. 50, 60 is not too bad. There's a retirement effect that happens in some data. Something weird happens at exactly 85, a round number. Something happens at 100, which is a really magic round number. All of those stories, we got them without losing any accuracy. And many of the graphs have those sorts of stories on them. You'll just have to take my word for it, because I'm only going to show you a few of these graphs. Here's an interesting thing. How many of you think that a model should predict you're 102, you have pneumonia? How many people think the model should actually predict that you're lower risk than you're 95, and you also have pneumonia? I mean, biologically, it doesn't make sense, right? We think this is the result of an unconscious decision that's being made about how to treat the patient. It's not biologically, medically a good model, even if it might accurately capture the way healthcare tends to work in practice. So we have to decide what we want to do. A cool thing about this model is, although millions of decision trees were trained to train these graphs, once you have the graphs, we throw the trees away. The model really is the graphs. And that means if we want, we can edit the model, and we can decide, I don't like the fact that risk is going down right at 100, 101. I'm just going to monotonically have risk slowly go up past, say, 85. That's a decision. We don't have any data to support that. If we had data to support it, well, maybe the model would have learned the right thing in the first place. So this is going to be a clinician saying, I think I understand why there's that drop. Given how we're going to use the model to make admit decisions or treatment decisions, I don't want to predict that a 105-year-old is lower risk than a 95-year-old. So let's modify the model this way. Accuracy on the test set, by the way, will go down slightly. And that's because our test set is a random draw from our training set, and the statistics that are true of the training set are also true of the test set. So we're going to accept a small loss in accuracy by making this edit to the model. Now, do you always want to edit the model? Well, I don't know. If you're an insurance company who hopefully isn't going to intervene very much in the patient's care, you might just want to know, oh, wow, patients over 100 are a little more likely to survive pneumonia. I got to keep more money in the bank or charge the patient more or something like that. So if you're an insurance company, maybe you don't want to edit the model, but if you're going to use it to triage patient care and treatment decisions, maybe you do need to edit the model. It's one model trained on one data set, but depending on what you're going to do with the model, you may or may not want to edit it. This is a critical part of the story. Model correctness depends on how you're going to use the predictions that come from the model. There is no such thing as the model is right or the model is wrong if somebody doesn't tell you what it's right for or what it's wrong for. That's critical. There's no such thing as, wow, it was good data, I trained a really good model, it's a great model. That doesn't mean anything. If you don't know how the model is going to be used, you can't actually say whether it's a good, bad, right, or wrong model. Let me show you a few things this model has learned. This is pneumonia risk, okay? There are jumps at round numbers. I'll show you a few more of those. Those are almost always human policy effects. There are very little phase change happening in biological systems. Sometimes in physical systems we'll see a phase change, but not in biological systems. It's almost always human social policy effects. The model has learned that the asthmatics are lower risk of dying from pneumonia. Wow, you've got a history of asthma, and it lowers your chance of dying from your pneumonia that you have now. That's a little surprising. The model has learned that having heart disease is good for you. If you had a heart attack 2 years ago and now you've got pneumonia, good for you, right? The model has also learned that having a kind of wheezing called stridor, which indicates that some of your airways are blocked, which is a sign of advanced pneumonia, the model has learned essentially that advanced pneumonia is good for you if you've got pneumonia. Okay, that doesn't make sense. What's happening here, what the doctors tell us is, well, you know, the asthmatics are paying attention to their breathing, they notice the problems early, they take it seriously, they try their inhaler, the inhaler doesn't work because it's not designed to treat pneumonia for very long. They've got me, they call my office, they have somebody who treats their asthma, and they say, the inhaler didn't work, I'm not feeling so good. And the doctor's like, well, get in here, you get an appointment, and hopefully the doctor diagnoses you've got pneumonia. And the doctor's thinking, wow, you got a history of bad asthma here, now you got pneumonia. You got to care early, and you get very high quality care because of your prior conditions. And that's enough to take what doctors are convinced that having asthma is bad for you if you've got pneumonia. It's enough to actually flip the sign and suddenly make having asthma look like it's good for you. And that's because the asthma caused you to get to high quality care rapidly. Same thing we think is happening with heart disease. You had a heart attack 2 years ago, your lungs, your chest feels funny this morning. If you're smart, you're thinking, I might be having another heart attack. You call an ambulance, you get to the ER in an hour, you get to the front of the line, they put probes on you. 1 minute later, they know you're not having a heart attack. And then if they're good, later in the day, they figure out, you've got pneumonia, you got a history of heart disease here. You're going to get treated very, very well, and you're already in the ER. So you got to healthcare even faster than the asthmatic. How can it be good to have advanced pneumonia? Like, that really still doesn't sound like it makes sense. And the error bars are pretty big. But here's the story the doctors kind of figured out, which is, imagine you have two patients who are equally sick, equally at risk of dying from pneumonia. And one patient has, let's call it, a silent symptom. And another patient has symptoms which you can't ignore. Stridor is this terrible wheezing. If one person in the room had wheezing, this kind of wheezing, we would all know it. So you can't ignore this symptom. Like, the patient knows, and everybody in the same room with the patient knows they have to go to the hospital. Whereas if you have the silent symptoms, maybe it's another day or two before you know you have to go to the hospital. It turns out the stridor is acting as a canary, which forces you to get to care as rapidly as possible. And you don't get ignored when you get there. You get very high quality care because they quickly detect that some of your airways are blocked. So all of these things are good for you. This is statistically all true in the data. All of this is good for you because it causes you to get treatment. So this is standard confounding, statistical confounding treatment effects. Philip is here somewhere, so Philip brought this up in his presentation just before mine. And the cool thing about these models is, because the graph is the model, we can edit the graphs, and we can, for example, just flatten the graphs, make these effects go away. Or what the doctors actually say is, the asthmatics are at elevated risk, the heart disease patients even higher risk, and the stridor patients, wow, they're really sick, put them at the highest risk. So we can do that. Once again, the accuracy will go further down on the test set. And that's because the test set does not reflect this, even though clinically the doctors are confident that this is the more correct thing to do. So this is very interesting. What's important to realize is that if you were to leave the model the way it is, including that being over 100 is good for you, then the model is rewarded with extra high accuracy by predicting these wrong things. And that should bother you, that a model could be rewarded with higher accuracy for actually doing the wrong things. And that's because it's a supervised learning model, it's not a perfect causal model. Okay, so that's the fundamental problem here. The most important lesson to take home from that is that accuracy is not true north. Accuracy and correctness are not the same thing, and I think all of us would probably prefer correctness over accuracy. So let's talk about that for a second. Why can predicting the wrong things make your model look like it's more accurate? Well, we usually optimize the accuracy of our models on held-aside test data, right? So we do retrospective analysis. That means our test set looks a lot like our training set. So, and it turns out even if you get your test data from different hospitals, well, they also treat their asthmatics and heart disease and stridor patients similarly to this other good hospital. So the same statistical effects are going to be in the data, even if it's coming from other places. So what we really are interested in is prospective analysis of our models. That is, how are they going to do in the real world? And what the clinicians are doing is they're editing these models because they think the edits will make the model more accurate, safer in the real world, even though the accuracy goes down on the test set. This is a well-known problem to people who work in causality, but I think the true magnitude of it wasn't so obvious until we started seeing these very high accuracy glass box methods that we'll talk about. And just so you know, and I know you're sitting there thinking, oh man, this pneumonia data set's really got problems, but my data's good. We have never, ever seen a complex data set that didn't have these kinds of problems. Now, 90% of what's in your data set is great, and I'll show you some wonderful things we can learn from good data. But 5 or 10% of what's in your data set is truly scary, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. Okay, sometimes it's the world that's not correct. Your data's okay. This is blood urea nitrogen, a blood test everybody in the room has had. And this model is roughly right, which is below about 30 is low risk. That's good. And then risk starts to go up as you go above 30. Interestingly, it flattens right around 50. Then it starts to go up again. It peaks right at 100. And by the way, the units for blood urea nitrogen were not picked to correspond to these peaks. That's very interesting. So again, round numbers are happening here. And then the risk actually comes down. Well, what's happening is this is statistical confounding with treatment. So at 50, patients are being given a medication for their high blood urea nitrogen, and it's effective. That medication actually mitigates risk, and it flattens. Goes down very slightly, but it's flat. And then at 100, they're given dialysis, and dialysis is really effective, okay? If we're worried about something in your blood that shouldn't be there, and we take your blood out in order to purify it of that thing, believe me, that's an effective procedure. So what's interesting, though, is that this model is saying that patients who have a blood urea nitrogen of 120 are actually lower risk than patients who are healthier with a blood urea nitrogen of, let's say, 90. That's sort of unfortunate, right? And that's happening because the patients over 100 are getting dialysis, whereas not many patients at 90 are getting dialysis. So one of the things you can do with this sort of model, if you're careful, you've got to be very careful when you make assumptions like this, but causal learning requires assumptions, so we'll have to make assumptions as well. We can predict that if we were to move the treatment threshold for dialysis from 100 down to, say, 85, that the risk curve would look no worse than this red line. And the area between that new red line and the original graph is lives saved. And in the United States, this would be something like 2,500 to 5,000 lives per year might be saved by this simple change to a treatment threshold for dialysis for blood urea nitrogen for pneumonia patients, right? That's a pretty narrow case, and we can have that kind of impact. It could be as many as 50,000 people worldwide if we were to make that kind of change. And in fact, this is an old data set. If you look at new data set, doctors have learned this, and they have started lowering the threshold at which they apply dialysis. So they're getting this benefit without having seen this model. Treatment effects everywhere. This is your systolic, the higher of your blood pressures. It is not the case that as your blood pressure starts to get very elevated, if it gets more elevated, that's good, and then eventually it's bad, but then if it gets even more elevated, it's good again. That's not what's happening. What's happening is, notice these are at round numbers. It looks like 175, 200, 225. These are all thresholds, which are causing, in some cases, policy change to treatment, like, oh, over 200, we use this other treatment threshold, just like we give dialysis above 100 for blood urea nitrogen. And it's also psychological. The doctor says, wow, you're 205. That's incredibly high. We got to do something that's serious. And you're just more likely to respond to the doctor than if they said, wow, you're 195. That's pretty high. We really have to treat you. And the model's amazingly sensitive, by the way. So what's interesting is this looks like it's 175. Turns out it's not, and that always bothered me that it was not 175. 180, and it turns out, I just learned this from a doctor a couple months ago, it turns out the definition of hypertensive urgency is 180, not 175. So in the model has kind of learned that something interesting is happening right at 180, and it happens to be the definition of hypertensive urgency, which, if it's in your medical record, means that they will treat you differently. Okay, whether you need to edit this model depends again on how you're going to use the model. If all the patients will receive this treatment, well, then you can leave the model the way it is because it accurately reflects what's probably going to happen to patients. But if having the model predict that patients who are at 215 are a little bit lower risk than patients at 200, if that means they wouldn't get the treatment that they would have gotten at 215, well, that's bad. Then you have to fix the model. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let me tell you briefly what pairwise interactions are. Think about exclusive OR. I give you one of the bits and I say, oh, B1 is bit value 1. And I say, what's the exclusive OR of B1, B2? And you should be thinking, well, I have no idea until you tell me what B2 is. I can't tell you anything. It's still 50-50. It could go either way. So there are things that you can't do as additive functions of bit 1 plus an additive function of bit 2. You really have to reason about the two bits together. This is risk as a function of the patient's age. This is risk as a function of whether the patient has cancer or not. Having cancer does increase your chance of dying from pneumonia. But there are some things you can't learn by reasoning about them individually. These two graphs are in the model, but there's also a third graph in the model, which is now a two-way interaction between age and cancer. And I just want to draw your attention to this bottom yellow region. Yellow means add 0.5. That's a big logit. Add a lot of risk to very young patients. Wow, I thought being young was good. Add 0.5 to very young patients who have cancer. So why would they be an unusual case? Well, it turns out young cancer patients have different kinds of cancers than older patients. So that's one of the differences. The other thing is we treat young cancer patients more aggressively than older cancer patients, in part because they can often survive the treatment. And if you know about cancer treatment, you essentially drive the patient close to death in the hope that the cancer dies before the patient does. And we can do this more aggressively with young patients. But that treatment often kills the immune system of the patient. And if they have pneumonia, having your immune system knocked out is a bad thing. So the model has all by itself learned that there's a special category, a very sad category, of particularly young patients who have cancer and who now have pneumonia. And that puts them at higher risk of dying from the pneumonia. So effectively, they're dying from a side effect of the treatment, which caused the pneumonia that they got, not because of the treatment, but they got pneumonia somehow. It causes the pneumonia to be higher risk for them. So that's what a pairwise interaction looks like. All right, let me jump to a different data set. This is ICU mortality. So you're in the ICU. We're trying to predict your chance of living or dying. This is PF ratio. It's a measure of how well you're breathing. And low PF ratio means very little oxygen in your blood. That's bad, high risk. And high PF ratio, like out near 1,000, means you're breathing great. And I just want to draw your attention to this little anomaly in the graph. It's kind of strange. So what's going on there? When we first saw this graph, we had no idea. Here's a clue. Turns out the bottom of that little spike is the same risk as the healthiest patients in the model, patients who are breathing really well. It turns out there were missing values for this feature before we got the data, and somebody had imputed them with the mean. And the mean of this feature, 60% of the patients are missing it. The mean for the 40% who are not missing it was something like 323. So suddenly we have 60% really healthy patients who have 323. Now, why are they missing it? What doctors do is they pinch your finger. If pink returns quickly, they know there's oxygen in your blood. They don't bother with the PF ratio test. So that's why there are a lot of healthy people who have PF ratios, unfortunately, 323. So this is very interesting, and the interpretable model helps us see this problem. It helps us detect that we have a problem. And it took us, 15 minutes to figure out, it was a missing values problem, as opposed to some other weird artifact that was happening in the data in the hospital record system. Now you might think, God, who would use the mean to impute missing values? What a stupid thing to do. It's the worst possible thing you could have done. Turns out it's the worst possible thing you could have done except for everything else. So one of the beauties of interpretable machine learning is you can try every trick you want to try to pre-process to clean the data, including you can try random forest imputation, k-nearest neighbor imputation, not imputing at all. You can try everything you want, median imputation. And then you can retrain the model after you do each of those things. And then you can look at the graph and you can see if your clinician thinks that graph is better or worse. And what's happened here, so this is the mean of the feature. Notice there's this spike. The blue curve is the curve we saw in the previous graphs. This is random forest and k-nearest neighbor imputation. And notice what's happened is that all of the imputation has basically put these healthy patients in the region sort of 150 to 400. They're still in a relatively high-risk region. Whereas you would have liked imputation to be smart enough to put them all out at 1,000. But it's not smart enough to do that. That's a hard thing to do. So in fact, what it's done is it's completely lowered the risk curve for everybody in this region that goes from, say, 100 to 400 or 500. That's bad. It has damaged the model. It has made this feature much less valuable and correct than it should have been. You would have been better off leaving it with imputation with the mean and just accepting that you're going to make an error at this one place. And that error, for the patients who are imputed with the mean, it'll be fine for them because they really are low risk. But unfortunately, there are some real patients who have a value of 323, and they'll fall in that bin, and their risk will be imputed low. But at least you'll only affect the small number of patients who fall in the bin, whereas if you do some other clever, more fancy imputation method, you'll actually spread the damage throughout the entire feature, and you'll hurt more patients. So it turns out interpretability has completely changed how we think about dealing with things like missing values. And that's just because we can try every trick we know for missing values, and we can see what happens. And for the first time, we can see what happens. And by the way, accuracy actually does favor random forest imputation, but not correctness. Okay, so correctness is what we're after. And after seeing this, what we ended up doing was coding the missing value for PF ratio as -1. We just put it off to the side of the graph. And I hate doing that, but it turned out to be the best thing we could come up with for this particular feature. Not every feature will have exactly the same problems. Let me just tell you briefly about some cool stuff with Wikipedia. It turns out 15% of the edits that happen on Wikipedia are malicious. The person's intentionally trying to either spread false news or they're trying to curse and have fun, things like that. This is one, we trained a model for them 5 years ago. This is a risk as a function of the time on a log scale in seconds since you became an editor, okay? So these are people who have not been editing very long. These are people who have been editing a much longer time. And the risk, notice it's +2 at the top here and -0.5. That's a difference in log scale of 2.5, which for classification is huge, right? That's more than a 10-to-1 difference in risk of doing something malicious. Here's what's really fun. You'll see there's some jumps, in the graph. All of those jumps happen at interesting round numbers. There's a 9-month effect, a 1-month effect, 5-day effect, 30-minute effect, 60-second effect, and a 5-second effect. When your model is learning jumps that only happen at interesting round numbers, you know it's learning something real about the world, okay? Now, it could be something real about the data preprocessing or about the phenomena that affect the world. Let me just tell you what one of these is. The 1-month effect. Took us a couple days to figure this one out. Turns out, Wikipedia, you're a new editor. After a month, they log you out. For everybody. The only way you get back in as that same user is if you remember your user ID and you remember your password, and you go to the effort to log back in again. So when it turns out people whose goal was to do something malicious, either for fun or for fake news, often don't come back, or at least they don't come back with the same ID, or they don't come back at all. So it turns out leading up to the previous presidential election in the US, so this is the Trump-Biden election 2020, turns out they used this and they basically said, there's like 1,000 pages that we think are critical for the election. We don't want any last-minute edits happening that look malicious. So what we're going to do is we're going to say you can only edit these pages if you've been an editor for more than a month. And they use this sort of model to make that policy decision. So that's kind of cool that you can actually learn what hopefully was a correct, fair policy that might have some social impact by looking at a model like this. As far as I can tell, they're planning to do this again with the upcoming election. In fact, it may already be in force. Let me tell you about severe maternal morbidity. This is you're pregnant, you're giving birth, and something bad happens to the mother, either a hemorrhage, the mother needs blood transfusion, needs to have the uterus removed, things like that, okay? So those are all things that you would hope you could prevent from happening during a delivery. And if you ask doctors what makes a mother be at higher risk from this sort of thing, they'll say pretty consistently, well, hypertension, the mother's diabetic, if the mother has high BMI, those are the risk factors. And they're absolutely right, but they forgot the two most important factors. And one of them is, how big is the baby? And the second most important factor in this data set was, how tall is the mother? Which, you're thinking, wow, how does height come into this? Well, it's the only measure we have that might give us a correlation with pelvic opening. And if you think about it, this is basically saying it's the physics of birth that puts the mother, and it turns out the infant, also at risk, right? It's basically saying, if it's a big basketball and a small hoop, it's going to be a tough delivery. If the baby is smaller or the mother is a larger frame, there's a good chance, all other things being equal, it will be an easier delivery. Now, it only took us an instant. For the doctor saw this and said, oh, I'm sorry, I gave you bad data. And then within 3 minutes, we were all patting each other on the back for realizing how important this was. And then 3 minutes later, we realized, what's BMI, right? It's a ratio of your height and your weight. So we immediately wanted to create a BMI for pregnancy, which is the baby's weight divided by the mother's height squared. And by the way, we did optimize for whether that should be squared, and it turns out squared is the right thing. And it turns out if you create this new feature, you really end up with the single most important feature for predicting maternal morbidity and bad things that can also happen to the child during delivery, is the ratio, is this BMI for pregnancy. So that's kind of cool that an interpretable model has kind of guided us to do some feature engineering to create a new feature that we're now publishing, and hopefully it'll be widespread use at some point. It also, though, has driven home the importance of, height is a really lousy way of measuring frame size. You really can measure the size of the pelvic opening with a ruler. It's not a hard physical exam. So we really want to start collecting just better data, and we assume that that'll be even more important than height. That height will then be less important. Okay, let me skip this. Whoops. Let me just show you one thing from COVID-19. This is risk as a function of age, and there are jumps at all the usual places. It's a respiratory illness, kind of like pneumonia. What I want to draw your attention to is this big jump that's happening on the right at 95. And that's a big jump. It's +1 in risk on a log scale. It turns out, in the very early days of COVID-19, many hospitals had do not intubate orders for their oldest patients. And that's because intubation is itself a very aggressive, risky procedure, and they thought maybe the oldest patients couldn't tolerate it, so they withheld intubation. And what's interesting is you can see this is putting elderly patients at much higher risk. So obviously the risk of the procedure is nowhere near as bad as the risk of not doing the procedure, right? That's what the graph is telling us on a huge scale. So you obviously want to change this, and then either collect new data or edit the model or something like that. Can we automatically detect these sorts of problems? Like everything I've been telling you about, we train the models, and then we sit with clinicians, we go through graphs one at a time. There's 56 graphs in that pneumonia model. It takes real time to do that. one of the things you can do is you can code these graphs. Like anything that makes a model more interpretable to humans, turns out tends to make the model more interpretable to LLMs. And you can code these graphs in a way that the better LLMs actually understand them. So, and you do the usual like key value, kind of thing. You basically give it a vector representation, and you tell the LLM that's what you're doing. This is a vector representation for pneumonia risk. The chance of dying from pneumonia is a function of the patient's age. There are other graphs in the model, but this is age, and you give it the graph. And the model can do some amazing things. It can summarize stuff like you ask it, is risk monotone, and it can do reasonably well. You can give it queries like what's the average risk at a certain age. It can simplify the models in some cases. It can even say, well, a linear approximation to this region would be this. Here's the cool thing. We can also ask it, if it's a well-known medical problem like pneumonia, we can say, well, are there any anomalies in it? And here it says, the graph for creatinine, another blood test, shows a surprising decrease in dying from pneumonia when the creatinine goes above 5. Notice it peaks right at 5, just like blood urea nitrate. It also peaks at 3.5, 2 treatment thresholds that happen at round numbers. It's really surprising the risk is going down because higher creatinine is associated with higher risk. And the model is absolutely right that this is something that's wrong. Here's albumin, and here's just really cool. I included this because it's just fun. Firstly, this graph includes negative albumin levels, and that's biologically impossible. So maybe somebody should look into that. So that's great. So what we did was a little study which we call 4 doctors and an LLM walk into a bar. What we did was we wanted to see how well doctors compared with LLMs at finding these sort of surprises in these interpretable models. And we looked at the agreement. Like correctness is hard to define sometimes. So we just looked at how much they agree with each other. And by the way, the doctors, I hope they're not watching this because they still don't know. The doctors don't know that there's only 4 doctors and the 5th doctor is GPT-4. They don't actually know that because we don't want to bias them. And just a summary of the results, basically GPT-4 over-predicts anomalies. The doctors only sort of find about 30 anomalies in that pneumonia model. GPT-4 sort of finds almost 50, so it's over-predicting. The doctors tend to agree with each other on their findings, so they agree with each other like more than 90%, and they all agree with the uber doctor, the one who is the most senior, who has even though they don't know who it is, it's all blinded, but that doctor's really, really good. And GPT-4, they don't agree with it as much. And when we ask for explanations of why you think that's an anomaly, well, it turns out, again, the doctors tend to agree with each other and really agree with that uber doctor. And again, GPT-4 is not quite as good. The interesting thing is GPT-4 is already good enough to be a useful safety net. And I'm sad to say this. It found, in this pneumonia data set that we've worked on for so long, it found one thing that I thought, oh, it's wrong there. And the doctor said, no, that's right. That is an anomaly. So it actually found something that we've been missing for years, but it drew our attention to it. And the doctor's like, oh, I think that's actually right. So it's already at the point where it could be a useful safety net. And it turns out the new LLMs that are coming on, these are expensive experiments to run. You've got to get like lots of hours of clinician time to do this kind of experiment. So we can't just update it whenever we want. But already these things are doing pretty well. Now, notice we talked about editing the models, right? We edited the age over 85. We edited these things to tell us what the doctors did. We have a Photoshop-like tool that's also been open sourced called Game Changer, which is designed to make it easy for end users to do things to edit these models. And by the way, 2 of the co-authors are doctors from NYU Langone. So they helped us develop and vet the method. And you can do things like, here's a lot of noise in the data, so risk as a function of age shouldn't be non-monotone like that. So you can just sort of edit it to make that go away. You can do things like optimal monotonicity. You can pick a region of a graph or an entire graph and say it should be monotone, and it'll use the PAV algorithm to automatically find the optimal monotonicity conversion. So it'll do things like that. It gives you lots of capabilities that hopefully all make sense in the hand of end users who are not data scientists. And this tool really does sort of make it interactive and easy, and we force people to always document why they're making a change. so that we can roll that change back, so that we can explain it to an end user, we can explain it to another expert why that change was made. This is all very, very important. You don't want to just empower people to go in and play with their models, because that could lead to a lot of bad edits. So we do this. And an interesting question is, can we get an LLM to use this tool? Like if it finds anomalies and we say, oh yeah, that really is an anomaly, can you fix it? Can we get the LLM to then use the editor to go fix the thing somewhat automatically and then come back and say, okay, here's the edit I made, do you approve? But we haven't done any work along those lines yet. So I just want to briefly mention, when a model is simple enough that it can only learn main effects and a small number of pair effects and can't learn higher order complexity, it turns out the model is already very close to being differentially private, because the way you leak privacy is typically through a conjunction of attributes, like, oh, the person has an income of $100 billion, and they're a male, and they're 68 years old, and they live in Washington State. Guess who that is? So it turns out if you prevent that conjunction, then it's actually hard to leak information. And we can allow even no conjunction. Like if we do only main effects, there's no conjunction whatsoever. So our algorithm, right out of the box, was close to being differentially private, but in differential privacy, you have to be able to prove it's differential private. So we only had to make small mods to the algorithm that didn't hurt its accuracy very much. And it turns out, without much work, or I have to admit, much expertise in differential privacy on the part of us who did this work, it turns out, right out of the box, it's the most accurate differentially private learning algorithm for tabular data, not for images or text. But for tabular data, it's the most accurate differentially private algorithm, especially as you crank up the guarantees. Okay, hey, every data set has these flaws, confounding, it's everywhere. Don't think it's not in your data set. I've had people say, oh, I've got really good data, we don't have this problem. We train a model on it. Just like that, a few problems surface. High accuracy is not true north. It is not sufficient. In fact, it's often misleading. These glass box methods really give you the tools that you need to understand your model. And what you're really understanding when you understand the model is you're understanding the data. So that's what's critical. And this really helps you improve reliability, robustness, confidentiality, and things like that. If you're worried about bias in your model, maybe age, income, gender bias, race bias, things like that, you can even use these tools because you can edit the graphs. You let the model become biased, you can see the bias in the graphs, and then you flatten them or even correct them in a different way. Right now, these seem to be about the most accurate glass box methods available, but there are lots of people starting to work in this area, which is great. Stay tuned. There are lots of competing methods coming up. And now it looks like we can use LLMs to help understand what these models are doing, because if you think about it, everything I'm talking about is human in the loop, right? It's not fully automatic. You train the model, and then experts and data scientists sit together for long periods of time to look at the model and figure out what it's done right, learn from it. You know, can we improve healthcare by changing the dialysis threshold for blood urea nitrogen? Or is this term actually just something we should edit because of how we're going to use the model? Most important lesson you should learn is high accuracy does not mean your model is correct. Don't think that everything you do to make your model more accurate means you're making it more correct. That's not the case. And there is an open source package that has a lot of these tools in it. And thank you. And sorry I went over. I'll personally buy a beer for everyone in the room.